Rust 1.76.0 was released today, February 8th, 2024, thanks to the hard work of hundreds of contributors. I apologize in advance that today's audio and video production will be a little rougher than usual. I just moved. Let's dive into the new changes. Number 1. The rules for function ABI compatibility have been documented. These rules are an important concern in code that alters the type of function pointers, imports functions via extern blocks, or code that combines the target feature attribute with an extern fun declaration. If you're deep enough into FFI that this would affect you, there's a link in the description below to the new documentation so you can check it out. Number 2. The char and U32 types are now guaranteed to always be completely ABI compatible in function signatures. This builds on an earlier guarantee that they would always have the same alignment. Number 3. There's a new warn by default lint called ambiguous wide pointer comparisons. Wide pointers are pointers to dynamically sized types like trait objects or slices. They're called wide because in addition to an address, the pointer also includes metadata, like the length of a slice or, in the case of a trait object, the address of a vtable. This lint warns you that when you use normal comparison operators like the == operator, the metadata is also being compared, which is easy to forget. It recommends using functions such as standard pointer @== if you want to compare only the address of the value without comparing the metadata. This lint replaces the Clippy lint that did the same check for only pointers to trait objects. Since the new lint checks all types of wide pointers, it got a new name. Number 4, the unused must-use lint has been improved so that it warns when a pin struct is returned wrapping a value p that is marked must-use, but is not in fact used. This might seem like a corner case, but it is actually a fairly common pattern in async code at the moment. Hopefully async Rust continues to progress rapidly like it has in recent years so that we don't have to deal with this level of complexity in the future, but let's break down what's going on here. This is basically a manual implementation of an async function which returns a future which is the type that is actually marked must use. This lint already looks through box for anything marked must use, but this future is also wrapped in pin, which is what you need to do for async functions returning a future. So now when you call that function and forget to await the future, you get a nice warning. And just like that, async programming gets a little bit smoother. Number 5. A bug that could produce unsound code when dealing with an unsized field in a packed struct has been fixed. Number 6. Continuing the theme of fixing packed types, the computed size and alignment for trait objects that appear at the very end of a packed type has been fixed. Number 7. 5 new targets have been added and 2 have been removed. Let's go over them. First, we have support for the ARM64E architecture on iOS and macOS. This is functionality that was introduced in the A12 chips for iOS and M1 chip for macOS that uses pointer authentication codes to detect and guard against unexpected changes to pointers in memory. Then we have a target for the latest watchOS architecture for Apple Watches. And finally, we have 2 new targets that preserve Windows 7 support for PCs, since the existing PC Windows targets will soon drop support for Windows 7. Specifically, that support will be dropped in Rust 1.77 on March 21st, 2024, which will be its own item in my next release video. Finally, support for the deprecated Sun Solaris target for x86-64 has been removed, but it was already replaced with another Solaris target, so I guess I should probably call this one renamed instead of removed. But the last one really was removed. ASM.js was a subset of JavaScript that ran pretty fast and was targeted by Emscripten before WebAssembly became a thing. Anyway, the ASM.js unknown Emscripten target broke a long time ago, and someone kindly did the work to remove it. Number 8. The Rust C compiler can emit diagnostics in JSON format. When it does, it emits 4 types of messages: diagnostic, artifact, future incompatibility, and unused externs. Up until now, you just had to kind of figure out which message type you were dealing with by the differences in the JSON, which is kind of lame. So they added a new message type field to the JSON output that will literally be diagnostic or artifact or future incompat or unused extern, so that you can read the message with confidence that you know what you're looking at. Number 9. On Windows, Rust can now use the ehcont security feature. In classic Microsoft naming confusion, the full name is Control Flow Enforcement Technology, aka CET, aka Shadow Stacks. What does it do? To protect the path where the context is updated during panics, the binary enumerates valid unwind entry points in a dedicated section which is validated when the context is being set during the panic. Anyway, this is for the future because Windows hasn't enabled this yet, as far as I can tell. But when they do, Rust will support it out of the gate. Number 10, the debug macro now outputs the column number in addition to the line number. I absolutely love quality of life improvements like this. Such a small change, but so nice to be able to land on the exact spot when you click on the output in your IDE. So here's what the debug output looks like before the change, and here's after. Column 18 is right before the letter D in debug. Number 11. Format had a bug where it could display the wrong number of digits for the exponent in scientific notation. This code powers macros like format, printline, ePrintline, and other similar macros in the standard library that take format strings. The bug was that when you used a format string that indicated you ought to have, for example, 1 digit of precision after the decimal place in your scientific format, you could get an extra digit like we see here. This has been fixed so that only the correct number of digits are displayed in all cases when you are outputting your number in scientific notation. Number 12, the debug trait implementation for read-write-lock-read-guard and read-write-lock-write-guard no longer require that read-write-lock be wrapping a sized type. So now the debug trait implementation works when read-write-lock is wrapping a dynamically sized type such as a trait object or a slice. This fix was simply done by adding the questionably sized trait bound to the type parameters of these debug trait implementations to remove the sized restriction, as was apparently intended in the first place, but just accidentally not done. Number 13. You can now create a file on Windows even if a hidden file already exists at that path. Number 14. Most of the general hashing code lives in the standard hash module with the notable exception, up until now, of the default hasher and random state structs, which have lived in the standard collections hashmap module. But that has made it harder than necessary for people to find them, so they've been moved to the standard hash module with the rest of the hashing stuff. But fear not, they are still re-exported from the old location, so no old code will break. They just live in a more sensible place now. I tested out auto-completion with Rust Analyzer, and it already auto-completes from standard hash after the change is made, which is pretty cool. Now it's time to go through the stabilized APIs for this release. Number 15, Arc Unwrap or Clone and RC Unwrap or Clone have been stabilized. These methods will take a reference counter, or atomic reference counter, and if the value being referenced is only being referenced by a single reference counter, it will avoid cloning the value and instead unwrap the value and return it. If there are multiple reference counters associated with the value, then it will make a clone of the value and return that. Number 16, Result Inspect and Result Inspect Error have been stabilized. These methods take a closure that accepts a result, and then for the inspect method, if the result is an OK, then it passes the result to the closure. For the inspect error method, if the result is an error, then it passes the result to the closure. So if you had a result of some kind, like here we have an OK value, you could already use an if-let statement to inspect the result if it is an OK, then use its inner value. These new methods let you do the same thing, only in functional style instead of imperative style. Number 17, Option Inspect was also stabilized. This is similar to the result inspect method. If the option is a sum, then it passes the inner value to the closure you passed in. Number 18, type name of val was stabilized. The type name of val function in the standard any module takes a reference to any value and returns a string describing the name of the type of the value. Note that this type name is intended to be used for debugging, and there's no guarantee that it will be unique, that it will stay the same between platforms or versions of Rust, or that it will even be the best way to describe the type. This functionality was already exposed by the type name function in the same module, but that function required you to name the type as a type parameter in a Turbofish, which is less ergonomic. Number 19. Pointer from ref and pointer from mute have been stabilized. These functions convert immutable and mutable references, respectively, into raw pointers. These functions are safer than casting to pointers with the as keyword because they will never silently change the type or mutability, which could be a problem when you refactor your code later if you cast with the as keyword. Number 20. Pointer adder equal has been stabilized. Good thing too, because the new lint we talked about in number 3 today recommends using this function. It compares the addresses of two pointers for equality, ignoring any metadata in fat or wide pointers. Now it's time for rustdoc changes. Number 21. Rustdoc's handling of the config and .config attributes was improved so it properly documents the requirements for an item to be used when the config and .config are not identical. Number 22. There is now a setting to hide the persistent navigation bar. You can find the setting in the gear menu under Hide Persistent Navigation Bar. For a large window, the persistent navigation bar is the sidebar. When you enable the setting, the sidebar disappears, and a button appears that you can press to reveal it again. You can also resize the sidebar by clicking where I've highlighted in red and dragging. They decided not to add a visual element to suggest a draggable border, which is disappointing, but hey, at least you can resize it if you know about it. On smaller screens, the persistent navigation bar is the top bar, and hiding it causes a similar button to appear to restore it. Number 23. The search box in a site generated by rustdoc now supports traits and associated types when you are doing a function signature search. For example, let's say you have a function that looks like this and you generate the documentation for it. To do a function signature search, you do a search with a return arrow in it, like this one. This searches for any function or method that takes any type, that's the generic T, and returns a usize. This matches our function here because it takes an argument and returns a usize. But this search is so generic that it will probably return lots of other functions that we don't care about in the search results. So now we can specify that we want to find a function that takes a type that implements an iterator over a U32 and returns a usize. This will narrow down our search much more. For convenience, you don't have to specify the name of the associated type, so we can remove the item equals part of the search. And if we don't care what type is being iterated over, we can leave out the type parameters to iterator entirely. So documentation search is just getting better and better. Oh, and a fun side note. Add a comma and fnmute to the left-hand side of your search if you want to restrict your search to methods that take a mutable receiver, or in other words, methods that take a mutable reference to themselves. This isn't part of this change, it's just something cool I wanted to point out. Number 34. Comments in item declaration documentation are now syntax highlighted so that the comments are easier to distinguish from the important stuff. That finishes our rustdoc specific changes, but don't worry, we've still got other changes to cover, like number 35. There's a new allow by default compiler lint that you can enable if you want to. Unit bindings checks to see if you bind a unit type to a variable without indicating that you intended to do that, because the unit type only exists at compile time, so assigning it to a variable doesn't actually do anything at runtime. Number 36. The job server helps Rust and Cargo interoperate with Make and still build things in parallel. When the Rust compiler detects that the job server isn't being inherited correctly, it emits an error, which should make it easier to debug exotic build setups. Number 37. Rust now requires LLVM 16 or 17, dropping support for LLVM 15. Number 38. The internal compiler function printTTS has had its output improved. PrintTTS is a function that pretty prints token trees. It is used in things such as the stringify macro, the display trait implementation for the token stream type, and diagnostic output. Number 39. The implied bounds entailment deny by default lint has been uplifted into an error. The check works well, and if you have the problem, you could generate unsound code. So making this an error prevents people from disabling lint and causing themselves problems. Number 40. When iterating over a vector and collecting back into a vector, the flatten, flatmap, and array chunks iterator methods can now iterate in place, meaning they can alter the starting vector to use as the result vector and avoid allocating more memory. Number 41, the default keyword that is supposed to be used when specializing traits is now properly rejected when applied to free const items. Now it's time for some cargo changes. Number 42. On Windows, cargo.exe now has a manifest file that states the compatibility with Windows versions 7, 8, 8.1, 10, and 11, sets the code page to UTF-8, and enables long path awareness. Number 43. The output for cargo-list is now colorized like most of the other cargo output. Number 44. The -- optional flag for the cargo add subcommand now uses the new optional dependency syntax that was introduced in Rust 1.60. This new syntax uses the dep prefix to indicate optional dependencies. Number 45. This one was done by my friend Ed Page. Just a reminder, if you want to call out and/or your picture displayed on your contributions, just reach out to me through the contact information on my webpage and let me know. And I'll do my best to recognize you when your work comes up. Right now I'm focusing on recognizing the person who opens the pull request on GitHub. Maybe I'll be able to expand that to collaborators and reviewers in the future. We'll see. Anyway, the package ID spec that Cargo uses was enhanced to be unambiguous to unblock the work on user-facing IDs. Number 46. Now, instead of ignoring a lints section in a virtual workspace configuration, Cargo emits an error. Number 47. Cargo wasn't checking to see if the name supplied to it was blank in some cases. Commands like cargo new have difficulty with blank input, so this is now checked and a helpful error returned. Number 48. There's a setting in the Rust-lang Rust repository that disables embedding Git hashes into binaries that some tools were honoring, but Cargo was not. But now it does. Number 49. Cargo now displays the number of errors left with a number even when there's only one error left. Number 50. Arlo Seamson, who I interviewed about Cargo's sparse index protocol last year, made a fix so when Cargo is compiled as an all-static binary, it no longer forgets to also statically link vendored libgit2. Number 51. Cargo now treats all 200-level response codes from crates.io as success codes as per the HTTP protocol's spec. Number 52. On Windows, Cargo now uses a non-deprecated function to get the path of folders, which should also prevent breakage for people who make really, really deep paths to stuff. Number 53. Colored output from Cargo broke in older Windows consoles, like in Windows 7, as of Rust 1.74. This has been fixed in Rust 1.76. Thanks, Ed. Number 54. Bash completion has been fixed when you're in a directory whose name contains spaces. Number 55. Cargo uninstall now works on Windows even when the binary you are uninstalling is running at the time. Number 56. There was incorrect information in the error message that was emitted when Cargo detected you were attempting to link the same external library twice. This has been fixed. Number 57. The -- quiet flag now works with more Cargo subcommands, including cargo clean gc, cargo config, cargo help, and cargo report. Number 58. A panic was fixed that could happen when development dependencies introduced a loop into the dependency graph. Now Cargo handles the cycle. Number 59. A panic was fixed that could occur when parsing a bad commit hash. Now an informative error is emitted instead. Number 60. The Cargo update command no longer does unnecessary git fetches while updating workspace members. That makes it faster and more efficient. Number 61. Cargo tags its cache directories with a cachedir.tag file. Even though the files have fixed contents that don't change, Cargo was overwriting them every time, even if they were already there, which was causing problems for build systems that disallow multiple writes to the same file. Now Cargo only writes the file if it's not there. Thanks, Arlo. Number 62. Cargo was ignoring all directories named target, which was too broad. Now it only ignores the target directory if it is in the root of the package. So now you can have your own subdirectories named target elsewhere without encountering mysterious problems. Number 63. The cargo package command now emits an error if a custom build script location is specified and that build script is not present within the package. Number 64. If you specify a 1Password account to use for credentials on the command line, Cargo now passes through that information and no longer asks you to choose which account to use. And finally, we have some new Clippy lints in Rust 1.76. Number 65. Infinite loop is a new allow by default lint that checks to see if you have an infinite loop inside of a function that is not marked as divergent with the exclamation mark return type, and suggests that you either mark the function as divergent or add a return or break statement inside your loop. Number 66. Ineffective open options is a new warn by default lint that checks to see if you are calling both append true and write true on an open options, and suggests that you only call append true since that already enables write true. Number 67. Uninhabited references is a new allow by default lint that detects references to uninhabited types such as the exclamation mark and warns when those are either dereferenced or returned from a function because that is undefined behavior. Number 68. Repeat vec with capacity is a new warn by default lint that looks for places where a vector is created with a specific capacity, but immediately passed to something that clones the vector, which doesn't clone its capacity, making the initial allocation of capacity entirely wasted. Number 69. Test adder in doctest is a new warn by default lint that checks for a test attribute in doctests, because unintuitively, this will prevent the doc test from running in tests. Number 70. Option map or err OK is a new warn by default lint that checks for the use of map or with an err and an OK as its arguments, and suggests you just call OK or instead. Number 71. Join absolute paths is a new warn by default lint that checks for calls to path join that start with a path separator, double backslash, or a forward slash. This is bad because if the argument to path join starts with a separator, it can overwrite the original path. If this is what you want to do, you should just use path new instead. Number 72. Impl hash borrow with stir and bytes is a new deny by default lint that emits an error if you attempt to implement the hash, borrow stir, and borrow U8 traits on the same type. This isn't possible because hashing a string slice gives a different result than hashing a byte slice. Number 73. Iter over hash type is a new allow by default lint that prevents the use of hash collection types as the source of for loops, because the order results will be returned in is not defined. The Ferris the Crab image on today's title picture is by Rebecca Beck Rumble, the executive director of the Rust Foundation. This Ferris appears to have been hand-drawn in black lines using a tablet painting program and then colored via the just scribble a color over the whole page so I can go play outside method. But that has not been confirmed with the artist. You can download the image at https://lang.org/image/ferris/beck.png. If you want more videos like this, then like and subscribe. If you are a professional software engineer who wants to learn Rust quickly, visit ultimaterustcourses.com and enroll in one of my online Rust courses.